Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Henderson, and this is our launch event for Castle of Horror Anthology Volume 4, Women Running from Houses. You can actually see it behind me. This is our fourth anthology in the Castle of Horror series, and I think it's one that has a theme that instantly, the moment that we told people that we were going to be using the theme of women running from houses, I started hearing from both writers and readers who are like, I want to see that one. I want to be involved in that. So I'll say just a couple of words. And then what I want to do is go to each of the authors, have them give a brief introduction of themselves and what their story is about. Okay, Women Running from Houses basically is a reference to the covers of Gothic romance novels from the mid-century, the 60s and the 70s. So, typically you would have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds over that period of novels where literally the cover would feature, just as it does on the cover of our anthology, a house, usually with a single illuminated window, and a woman with great hair, but in any kind of dress. She might be in a nightgown, she might be in a dress, she might be in a pantsuit, running from the house, usually across the moors or something like that. And that remained from about the mid-60s, and then it stopped resolutely in the late 70s and disappeared forever. That whole period was called Gothic romance, and then it was gone. And I have always found it fascinating that a literary period so recent to us that in many of our, depending on how old we are, in our living memory, it existed. You go to the drugstore and get them, and it's gone now. And anyway, I thought this was something that I had seen a lot of people blogging about, and a lot of writers I knew worked in the Gothic, which tended to mean a love for the mystery of things that are old, family secrets, and often would involve a female main character who came to a great house to unlock its secrets. It was a form that found its creativity in the reuse of certain forms and tropes. So we put the collection together, and you'll find that there's a great variety in the kind of stories that people develop, some of which are extremely traditional Gothic romance stories, right down to a governess that goes to a house. I'm thinking of John Ohno's story, and some are science fiction that belong almost in the Martian Chronicles, and there I'm thinking of Incher Yo's science fiction, and any number of things in between. I'm going to give the authors a chance to explain for themselves, and then we'll come around and do some general topics afterwards. And if there are questions from the audience, that would be groovy too, because what you're interested in hearing about and what the authors are interested in talking about is far more interesting than what I just randomly asked you to talk about. So I'm much more interested in what excites you guys. So let's get started. I'm just going to go in the order of the table of contents. So opening up the collection is actually a story of the early 1970s. Jim Towns, two-story carnivore. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the story that you came up with.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jim Towns. I am a screenwriter, filmmaker. I live in Los Angeles. I've made a couple feature films, most of them kind of horror films. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided to start getting back into writing fiction. I'd only been screenwriting for the last 15, 20 years. Finding that it's a very different muscle than screenwriting. It's definitely apples and oranges. Not only is there a tense difference, you're writing in the present tense, and in screenwriting you tend to write in the there's a subconscious level to it and everything. So anyway, it was an interesting experience. It took me a while. I started doing a lot of short story stuff, and eventually started getting published in anthologies here and there. I've probably done about 20 different anthologies now. I don't know, in literary magazines. My first actual full-length book came out this year. It's called American Cryptic. It came out in January. and it's a collection of not just ghost stories and uncanny stories from Pittsburgh and the Western Pennsylvania area where I'm from, but beyond that as well. But it's also kind of a hopefully anthropological kind of breakdown of why we turn people into boogeymen, what need that fulfills. So that's available on Amazon and everything else.
We talked about this on the podcast. It was a really good book.
Right. Yeah. And Jason, that's how you and I kind of met and stuff. And then you reached out and were like, hey, we're doing this, thing about women running from houses. Would you be interested? I was like, yeah, I'd be interested. Yeah, that's right up. I didn't have. I mean, sometimes someone asks me if I want to be part of something, and I have an idea or I have the rudimentary makings of something that sort of suits it, and I can fix it in there. This I had absolutely nothing at all, so I started from nothing. My experience with this kind of story, I'm a little young to have read most of them when the Gothic romance thing was in its heyday, obviously. Although the covers is an idiom I am familiar with. It's the visual and stuff, and it's a visual that I think lends itself to a cinematic feel just by nature of the beautiful woman, the house in the distance, everything. It's evocative in that way. So it dovetailed naturally with the way I approach a storytelling, which is actually from a visual idea. Having not had a lot of experience reading stories like this, my input was mostly, again, cinematic. Thinking about this kind of story made me think of a lot of the Hammer films of this era of the 70s, 60s and 70s. So I started thinking about Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter, The Vampire Lovers, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, kind of things like that, where you'd have all these actresses. You'd have Caroline Munro, you'd have Ingrid Pitt, very often dressed in these kind of gossamer white nightgowns. So that was my into it, and that got me thinking, well, what if I really embrace the nature of the story? It's a woman running away from a house, obviously, but what if that's a story inside the story? What if it starts out with an actress as a main character who is running away from a scary house, and then it's revealed it's just part of a film that someone's making, very much like a Hammer film would have been made, like something that they would have churned out in that era. And I was thinking about how silly, just by nature, the idea of running away from a house wearing only your nightgown is, I guess, in the middle of nowhere. How vulnerable that obviously makes a character. So the idea came that obviously an actress doing this thing would be cold and uncomfortable and would really think that what she's doing is rather silly. And wouldn't it be funny if an actress who had to run away from a house in a nightgown for a movie, thinking it's silly, ends up having to, in short order, have to run away from a house in her nightgown in real life? And how do you get to that? And that's how the story evolved, and that's how I kind of came to it.
That's wonderful, and thank you for the context. All right, the next one actually is deeply haunting. I mean, painfully, deeply haunting. I was really moved by it. Bonnie Joe Stufflebeam, tell us a little bit about yourself and the lifespan of haunted rooms.
Yeah, hi. I'm Bonnie Joe Stufflebeam, and oddly enough, I am really this grainy in real life. So I am a science fiction, fantasy, horror writer, and I've mostly published short stories at this point. I've published over 70 short stories over the past few years, and I was nominated for a Nebula Award a couple of years ago, which was really cool. One of my stories appeared on LeVar Burton's podcast, which was also really cool. I also wrote a piece for the Sci-Fi Channel's The Magicians that was made into a little animated short that was put up onto their website, which was yet another really cool thing. And so the story that I ended up submitting, I had written already when I heard that, Jason was doing a women running from houses. I was like, oh, I actually have a story that, I wrote a while ago that never really found its place. And So it's about two sisters who have lost their parents in an accident, and they are trying to figure out what to do with the house. And the younger sister, they're 13 years apart, which was not at all based on personal experience. They're 13 years apart, and the younger sister really wants to keep the house and she doesn't want to let it go. And the older sister wants to sell the house. And so they're very different people, and they're kind of clashing over this decision that they have to make when they start to see these shadows come out of the walls. And of course, they think that the shadows are their parents. And so the house kind of becomes this character because, the house is manipulating these shadows and manipulating these sisters. And so the idea actually came from arguments I've had with my own sister about, like, my parents have this beautiful, beautiful house out in Fort Worth. And we've actually had the conversation, like, when our parents don't need this much space anymore, what are we going to do with the house? And for a long time, I wanted to live out there because it's in the country. And so I was inspired by the reality of those conversations. And I was also inspired by the idea of writing from a house's point of view.
I love that it is actually from the point of view of a very jealous and sad and needy house. That was
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, Amanda, I know you're there. Amanda Deweese. Yours was actually quite traditional as well. It was called the Rathburn Legacy. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about it.
Righty. I'm Amanda Deweese, and basically I write things in and around the Victorian era. That's just sort of what became home to me. In graduate school, I studied 19th century vampire literature, and so that sort of me in this direction. And I've loved the modern Gothic style and Gothic romances ever since I first started reading them, also in graduate school. So right now I write a Victorian supernatural mystery series, the sibling from Victorian Mysteries. And I've written a number of Gothic romances, some full length. I've done some novellas. I have a duo of Victorian vampire sort of Gothic romances. And I was one of the people, Jason, who was so excited hearing about this anthology. I was just absolutely delighted. It was just, this is my thing. So, but yeah, starting, a story with the knowledge it would have to be is trickier for me than most. I tend to write long. And so I started with just one of the very basic kernels of the Gothic story, which is the duality of the hero. And so I decided to make that literal in this case. He really is more than one person. And my story is set in the mid-19th century, and the heroine is a photographer. And I thought it would be fun to look at the trend of spirit photography that was so popular at the time from a different angle. So a lot of us have probably seen photos from the era where people have faked ghosts in the pictures. That was very being fascinating at the time. And so I thought, well, maybe I should have a camera that actually lets you see real spirits instead of it all being fakery. So that was kind of the basis of my story.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And one thing I'm pleased about is after we go through, I think we can rely on you as being sort of the resident expert on what the heck is up with Gothic romance in general, because a lot of us just parachuted in. One person who didn't, Charles Rutledge, I know that you're on. Your story is actually continuing a series that you've already been writing, and it's called The House and the Witch Dreams, which is a play on another existing title. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Charles Rutledge, and I write what I refer to as crime horror. So it's basically crime novels and crime short stories that have monsters in them. And I write the Griffin and Price series with James A. Moore, which is about a private detective and a sheriff who live in the North Georgia mountains and get into all kinds of supernatural incidents. And one of the characters in there is an occult detective and specialist named Carter DeCamp. And I always have to remember how to say the title. As you say, it's a play on the Dreams in the Witch House. It's the house in the witch dreams. And DeCamp is the nominal hero of that one, though it's probably more the young woman who comes to him for help. But the H.P. Lovecraft did a story called, Dreams in the Witch House, which mine has virtually nothing to do with. It's more linked to another story of his, Pickman's Model. And that becomes apparent as you go through it. But anyway, this particular story came from an actual nightmare that I had. And in the nightmare, I was in an old house, which I apparently owned for no apparent reason. And there was something outside. There was someone walking around outside the house, crunching through the dry leaves, and they were muttering to themselves. And I was actually sick. It's a fever dream. And I didn't want anything to do with whoever it was, so I went to the window to pull the shades down. And when I did, this incredibly old and very horrific woman slammed her face against the window and started screaming, just howling at me. It was a terrifying dream. So anyway, I gave that dream to the lead character, Sarah Upton. And if you read Pickman's Model, you know that the Pickman, his name is Richard Upton Pickman. And so that does have something to do with it. So I kind of play with the ideas that some things in fiction actually happened and some things kind of happened. And, I have two novellas that feature Dracula. And the idea behind those is most of the events did actually happen, just maybe not quite the way that we did them. But as you and I talked about before, Jace, my mom read literally hundreds of Gothic romances when I was very small. And I collect them. I have boxes of them. So I have lots and lots of women running away from house covers. So anyway, that's me.
I first discovered the running away from houses covers, like on this blog a couple of years ago. This woman was making a habit of collecting them and cataloging the painter of each of the paintings. And it was really wonderful. I'm glad that she did it. And I don't know why she quit. I mean, I haven't been able to get a hold of her to find out. But all right, we should keep moving so that our time is made use of. John Ohno, the House on Foulness. Can you explain this to me?
Okay, so I was thinking about the Slender Man murder from a couple of years ago. I was reading this article about how the two girls who were involved in that had this very intense relationship, and how that kind of relationship very often occurs between girls of that age. And then I was also thinking at the same time about the weirdness of the salt marsh ecosystem, right? Because you've got this sort of area where the plants can't really grow, right? Because half the time it's underwater, but then also the sea life can't grow, so you have stuff that only lives there. And how kind of, it's weird that Lovecraft never kind of explored specifically the salt marsh, because I had heard about a place called Foulness in England that's on a salt marsh, right? Because Warren Ellis had sent out in his thing, his email list, about how he had found this place, and it was an interesting name, and sort of separated by a sandbar from the neighboring area. And I had just recently watched The Innocents, and then I went on a long car ride, and it kind of a 6-hour trip, and it kind of came together. So I just sort of put all those elements together, and I sort of set it in right after World War I, because there's this idea that the 20th century is the century when we lose our sense that there's an axis to the world, and everything, we start to be unable to ignore the strangeness of the world, whereas previously we could sort of stick to the ordered stuff. We could, stick to our little specific science and say this is reproducible, but then that kind of blew up initially in the sciences with relativity, and then in international politics with World War I, that came out of everybody trying to do what seemed like a good idea in politics. So it sort of, I tried to sort of match the coming of age thing with of this character with the coming of age of sort of the world.
I think what I love the most is that image that pops up often of the house that sits in the middle of some kind of a bog, or in the case of the House of Usher, in the middle of a tarn, or that image, for some reason, of the house being locked by some foul expression of the earth is wonderful. Thank you very much. All right, Insure. So you can introduce yourself any way you want, Insure, but Insure Yo is a publisher. He's my co-publisher. We founded Castlebridge Media together, but he's also the guy who literally lays out all of the books and designs all of the covers. So if you've seen the covers for the Castle of Horror anthologies, he's done all of them, and he did this one. And you also contributed a story. So say what you will, Mr. Yo.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that if you do a Google image search for women running from houses, you get a lot of those old covers, but you also get our cover. Fantastic. And it fits, and it belongs with all the rest of them. I think it's fantastic. And I was pretty excited to see that. So, all right, my story is called The Fantasy Impromptu. And I grew up reading lots of science fiction. My first book that I wrote was a science fiction novel as well. But I always try to incorporate science fiction in everything I write. And so this definitely has a science fiction bent to it. It starts out with a woman who's an astronaut on her ship in orbit over a dead planet, seemingly dead planet, searching for life. And she does some scans and finally notices that there's a house that has appeared on the planet's surface, and has to go down and investigate what this house is and why it's the only surviving structure on the entire planet. And I don't want to give too much away because that kind of leads you more into the traditional Gothic side of it. But that was kind of the nugget, the concept that I came up with for my story.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And like I said, the funny thing was, reading it, I really had that thought of R's for Rocket or the Martian Chronicles, any of those 1960s Bradbury stories. It was cool. I'm next. I will say 15 seconds worth of words. House of Usher. Girl goes running, falls through a sinkhole, discovers the House of Usher in a sinkhole below Virginia. It is gonna be a novel, and I decided it would be cool to start doing a serial novel in our anthology series. So that was my story. Usher Down is part one of that, and I'm just gonna keep doing it through our every half year until I finish the novel, or until people just beg me to stop. So that's where we are. And so if you read it, that's what it is. Usher Down. Okay. Interestingly enough, Leanna Hieber, are you here, Leanna?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
All right. Okay. So Leanna Renee Hieber, your story is a legend, actually, and I really loved it. I love the way you write. Sea Found. Tell me about it.
So Sea Found is a bit of a departure for me from people who know my work, but interestingly enough, it was actually my first professional publication. So this was a reprint, and I was thinking about this theme because Charles and Amanda are two of my friends who we talk about this theme often, whether we're together in panels. I am glad at least we can panel across the wires here. A love of women running from houses and the traditional Gothic is like what brought us together on panels. And, you know, I think so for so many of us, there is a draw to this theme. I am a Gothic novelist, so most people know me from things like my Strange and Beautiful novels, which, as you can see, is a very dark and stormy night. But I'm usually known for doing Gothic Victorian work. And so this is a contemporary story. What's interesting for me about while I was writing this story, I was writing this concurrently with a few of my other very first professional publications, which were short plays. I'm a novelist and a short playwright with a few short stories. I really don't do many short stories, much like Amanda was saying, like I'm a lot more full-length novel writer sort of by trade and training. So it was an interesting way for me to say, okay, I have this snarky modern playwright voice, and then I have this Gothic Victorian novelist voice. Can I write a short story in a modern setting? Because again, my fiction that's not plays is mostly Victorian. And I was trying to kind of merge as I was first starting out, trying to really find where's my niche going to be, what really is my comfort zone. And I find that this is one exception where, okay, all right, I have this rare case where I can write a modern heroine. All the rest of my stuff ends up being a lot more 19th century. My voice is much more comfortable there. But the heroine of this particular story, she really came to me in this kind of snarky, kind of done, sort of emo, kind of done with the world sort of frame of mind, in which she is on vacation with the family, who she increasingly finds herself distanced from on the New England coast. And it's this rough patch of land in Massachusetts. And so she's got this, you know, family who doesn't understand her. She's on this very atmospheric coastline. She agrees with Lovecraft that New England is inherently odd. And she discovers this legend of the young man of the sea, who in a fit of pique, all my words are tumbled today, in a fit of pique did a really nasty deed, and he's haunted the shore for a century. This is a story I completely made up. There is not actually this legend, but it is very informed by many ghost stories that I have heard and taken in through the years. But I wanted to invent one for this because, you know, I sort of believe in paying homage specifically to a ghost story and telling it with an honor to the person. If you're not going to sort of honor the original ghost story, as I was not planning to, I wanted just to make it up whole cloth. And I realized that through the course of this short story, it really is my kind of my beginning of what would be a trend in some of my short stories. Again, I don't do many short stories, but when I do, they tend to be coming of monster stories rather than a coming of age story. I kind of write coming of monster stories. And I really feel like that's what's at play here. And it was fun for me to return and go back and clean up this old story and try to, you know, kind of bring it to me now, so many years later and so many books later, but still with a fondness for this particular story, realizing how much it would launch so many of my other types of stories of what I was drawn to. So I think that trying to take Gothic tropes and skewing them, trying to go from something that seems like is a tragedy and turning it around into something that is actually empowering, that's been a real theme in a lot of the things that I do. And it was fun to play with that in this story. And if I say anything else, I'll give too much away. So that's that.
Thank you very, very much. That was really cool. And all right, so interestingly enough, I believe that, and as I was laying these out, I tried to make the stories different from one another. So next was The Ghosts of Glen Muir, and it's a whole nother kind of story. Scott, are you there? Scott
I
Pearson?
am.
All right, tell us a little bit about yourself and about the Ghosts of Glenmuir.
Hi, I'm Scott Pearson. I'm a full-time freelance writer and editor. I'm primarily a science fiction writer, but I've been doing so much editing over the last few years that I just haven't been doing a lot of writing. And I decided this year that I really wanted to get back to writing. And I also like challenging myself to work in genres I haven't done before. So when I saw the ad for this anthology, I really wanted to get into it. And I really wanted to embrace the classic Victorian motifs of the Gothic, but I didn't want to write a period piece. And so I developed this very, very, very near future science fiction concept of a young woman who's gotten her doctorate. She's a supercomputer engineer, and she's developed this machine that's basically like an Xbox that runs in your dreams. And so then I'm able to use the dreams to go full on Gothic, and then have the waking sequences where you get a very contemporary take on, in some ways, how little things have changed for women and men in our world. And so that's where I came from.
I really loved, by the way, that yours was easily the most feminist of the whole lot. Yours was the one that included all the mansplaining and the guy who's taking credit for this woman's doctoral work and all of that. It was a really cool place for a Gothic romance anthology to go. Rob Nisbet, so
Yes.
It is 2 o'clock in the morning where you are. Why don't
It
you
is, and
tell
I'm
us-
asleep.
it's when?
It
Tell us a little bit about your story, which is shockingly, it is a kind of an origin story of Lovecraft himself.
It is, yes. I'm Rob Nisbet. I live in England near Brighton on the south coast. I've written about 60 short stories, mostly for women's magazines, so I have a little romance in the background. Also write horror and science fiction. I was fortunate enough to do a few audio science fiction stories for Big Finish for their Doctor Who range. And for this particular story, yes, I was interested in H.P. Lovecraft. It's interesting that Charles, John and Leanna have already mentioned him, so he's already there in the background. And I just took him and thought he'd be a very good character for a story. So then I researched him and found out all these details, and there is a story there already. His father was in an insane asylum, the Butler Hospital, and his mother actually ended up there as well, but that's not part of my story. And he had a very strange upbringing. His maternal grandfather was a great influence on him. He instilled a love of reading at an early age and writing letters. And there was one particular instance, he made Lovecraft as a 5-year-old walk through the house in the dark to conquer a fear and nightmares that he was having. So I used that. I made his nightmares real, had this grandfather force him through the house in darkness, and that was the beginning of a story for me. And it ended up as, are these monsters real? Was there an influence behind his writing that we didn't know about? So it's basically an influence on him to write the stories, but it enabled me to write this story as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, it was, I've never actually read a Lovecraft, I called it an origin story, and that was new for me. So I really appreciate
I'm glad it's new.
Mr. Aronovitz, Michael, tell us a little bit about Adriana, which is a completely different kind of story. It's actually very similar to Ms. Hieber's. It has the element of a legend to it. So introduce yourself and tell us a little bit.
Well, sure. Hi, guys. Thank you for having me. this makes me think of Joe Morey, who he ran Dark Regions Press with his son, and then broke off to Dark Renaissance Press. And he signed the paperback version of my first novel. And he said to me, write me a haunted house novella. You know, I'll pay you $500 or something like that. And I couldn't do it. I discovery write. I don't outline. I follow what I feel. You know, I get an image and I write it. And Jason, I've been really lucky with your first 3 anthologies because I had something that fit. And this one, I had nothing. I had nothing. So I decided I'm going to write my first piece of flash fiction. And the only thing I could think of, because I don't know a lot about the Gothic, you know, stuff that we're doing. So I thought, she's a ghost. She doesn't know she is. She's displaced into a future time. And the people moving into the house, she thinks they're the ghosts. And I just played with it that way. And that's it.
And you know, it's so funny you think of it that way. That's the actual reveal at the end. But you say that what you're leaving out is so freaking grisly. The story is. I mean, it's really it maybe is not as violent as it appears, but there's something with all the grisly tools and the dripping and it works really well. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Jason.
All right. Jeremiah Dylan Cook, Lost Vintage. This is kind of fun because it was also a super contemporary story. It's an LGBTQ story. Tell us about it.
Well, that story started, I was on a hike with my wife for a 1-year anniversary for our wedding. We were going to be in England, but due to COVID, we ended up on a hike in central Pennsylvania. And we found this really creepy, overgrown graveyard. And I instantly fell in love with it, took a bunch of pictures, knew I wanted to write about it. And I went back to my desk and started this story. My idea was a story about a graveyard that eats people because I thought that was awesome. But as I was writing it, I got maybe 1,000 words in, and this character, Camilla, appears in the graveyard. And I was like, well, that's not supposed to be in there. And so I just kind of took a break from it for a while. And it was probably maybe a month later that I saw the call for women running from houses. And I was like, well, that's going to fit perfectly with my graveyard. And it did. And the story goes crazy from there. She ends up finding the protagonist finds a house in the woods. And, you know, I drew on a lot of, so I don't have a ton of hiking experience, but I have a lot of friends. One of who is actually here, Chris, she does hikes all the time. And I drew on a lot of my friends' hiking experiences and from, well, me watching them on Instagram, at least, because I am not in the best shape to be going hiking every weekend like some people, unfortunately. But I drew on a lot of those influences to start that story. And then what I did to kind of finish it off was I think of Gothic horror is point A, and cosmic horror for me is like point C, and point B is Robert W. Chambers and the Decadence movement. And so I kind of threw in some Robert W. Chambers references and some Decadence stuff to kind of bridge the gap to get to cosmic horror and to get to a little bit of and to get Gothic horror in there. So it came together, and I was really happy with it. So.
Thank you very much. And it is such a specific. It feels very real. You know, if you know people who are through hikers, it's really cool to sort of reference that culture. Henry Herz. You know, this is the first time we've worked together. You came in through a mutual friend. Tell us a little bit about The Castle on the Loch.
Sure. So the reason I hadn't worked with Jason before is because I'm primarily a children's author. I have 11 titles, traditionally published titles, and only in the last year or two have I started writing adult short stories, fantasy, sci-fi, and horror. I'm one of the co-hosts of the San Diego chapter of Jonathan Mayberry's Writers Coffee House. And if you're friends with Jonathan Mayberry, you have to write horror. That's just the way it is. So I found out about the call, and when Jason shared with me the art template, the cover template that has been used for all these Gothic romances, I said, oh my God, that it tickled my funny bone. I was like, okay, I have to write a story for this. That would be really fun to do. I ended up writing The Castle on the Loch, which is my first Gothic horror story. So in a way, you could say that Jason Henderson took my Gothic horror virginity. So my idea for the story was I started with the Bluebeard folktale, where the women save themselves, as opposed to in a lot of the classic Gothic horror, you have the virginal maiden saved by the male hero, from the clutches of some tyrant or villain. And I thought, well, it would be fun to tweak the classic Bluebeard tale with Gothic horror, and also tweak it so that the character that saves the virginal maiden is female. And then I tweaked it further and made that character a Kelpie. So my story takes place in 17th century Scotland, and I don't want to give away any more than that, but it's so it's got a little bit of fantasy in it as well as Gothic horror.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad that we got at least one Scotland piece in there, because it goes well with the Rob Nisbet's Scottish piece from the last one that we did, which was also terrifying. But thank you, Henry. I'm so glad you joined us. Sam Knight, Shattered Piece of Heaven. You and I have worked together before. I think it was on the last anthology. So tell me about your story.
I liked writing it. I had a lot of fun writing it. Most of what I've published, I've got over 60 short stories published, and most of those are weird westerns. I just recently put out my second collection of them, recollecting the stories when I get my rights back, and put them out there to make sure they're available, because a lot of the things that get published in, they're around for a few years and then they're gone. Which I mentioned because most of what I write tends to have some kind of supernatural element to it. The thing that really caught my eye when you put this call out is that Gothic horror a lot of times has nothing supernatural in it, no matter how convinced other people are something supernatural is going on. So it caught my eye right away as something I wanted to do, because it was outside of what I normally do, because I guess my idea was to do something outside of what I normally do, because I wanted to do it with nothing supernatural in it. And I pulled that off fairly well, I think. Something else I really like to do is take what people expect and kind of turn it on its head. One of my favorite times I ever did that is I wrote a short story for an anthology called Ghost Hunting Critters with Julie Campbell, who writes about a ghost hunting dog and a vampire hunting dog. And she wanted, a collection of other kinds of critters that hunted animals. And I was trying to think, what's something people aren't going to expect. And I finally came up with the idea of a goldfish. So I had a goldfish that hunted, ghost hunting goldfish, and I really enjoyed doing that. So with that in mind, when I came to this story, not only did I not want to do something supernatural, I wanted to do something that wouldn't be what people were expecting. So of course, my woman running from a house had to be somebody who literally couldn't run from a house, and she's in a wheelchair. So that's where I came at that point, the point I started with it. And I just really had a lot of fun writing this. So Jason, thank you for putting these together and sending out the invites and stuff. It's a lot of fun to do these.
Thank you very much. I love the texture of that story, by the way. I mean, I really believe the orchard that they're in. So last but not least, and I mean really, really not least, I like to end the story with an interesting story that's kind of casts you in a new direction. Alethea Kontis, A Poor Man's Roses is a Gothic horror story, but just like with Inchers, it's a science fiction story. Tell us about it, please.
Well, I am New York Times bestselling author Alethea Kontis, I'm also a storm chaser, a Saturday songwriter. I narrate for Pseudopod and Escape Pod. I contribute regular book reviews to NPR. Like Henry, I write children's books. But everybody forgets that I got my start in horror. When I was in college, I was making horror movies with my friends. Crinoline Head, Blood Oath, Generation X. Look it up. They're terrible. They're terrible. But yeah, people totally forget. So when Jason invited me to be in the Castle of Horrors anthologies, I'm in 3 and 4, which I now have. I'm very excited. They're beautiful. They're so beautiful. I was very excited. And when obviously this theme was women running from houses, I was like, well, I have many to choose from. Which one would you like? And of course he picked the one that like was the weirdest, you know, non-obvious one. You have very good taste. You have very good taste, Jason. So Poor Man's Roses is a story with a lot of layers. The biggest, obviously, is the Patsy Klein influence. I lived in just outside of Nashville, Tennessee for over a decade, and Patsy Klein is kind of in the waters there. The Grand Ole Opry, Dolly Parton, if you don't leave that state worshiping Dolly Parton, what is wrong with you? Various things like that. So I just have a great story about Patsy Klein in my 15-year high school reunion. Ask me about that later. But I had actually just left Tennessee. It was really tough. I mean, whenever you leave a place, it's for a reason. And it's usually a really tough reason. And I went to go stay with a friend of mine who had just left her husband. She had had cancer and had been through many, many different trials and things. And she made a joke about how at this point she probably had super blood. So this story just sort of blossomed in my head about a woman in a post-apocalyptic Earth. And I mean, the Earth is dead. It's just, everyone took rockets and left. There's nothing left. And she has this super blood that her husband is harvesting from her so that he can kind of live forever and be a superhuman. But there's a word, an English word. I was a scientist, so I don't know the word in academia, but I wanted there to be a horrible situation that she needed to run away from into a place that is horrible. Like it's kind of a no-win situation. And especially when you run away from a horrible relationship, which Patsy Klein would understand. Mary Wollstonecraft, if you're still in the audience, you would understand. I've run from a lot of horrible relationships. Sometimes you think what I'm running to is maybe not better. It might not be better. So is it worth running? And I feel like Patsy was kind of stuck in that situation too for a bit until the universe took her out of it, really. But I loved researching this story. I loved getting to know Patsy. The more you know about Patsy Klein, the more you love the story, because there are so many Easter eggs hidden throughout. So yeah, I loved being able to tie in science fiction and the emotion and the drama, and somehow still, science fiction, but still totally a Gothic horror. There you go.
Thank you very much. The funnest thing about editing that one actually was redlining the different references to Patsy Klein that were hidden in there, and that was super cool.
I should have counted them so you could play a game to make sure you got them all.
Yeah, you're right. You know, you could create an interactive version that's essentially a game. What a fun idea to create an annotation game for anything, really. That's a cool idea. Wow. Okay, I would very much like to sort of open up for general questions, but I don't know if the audience has any questions. If they don't, I know that Julia has some questions. My lovely wife of a quarter century is here, and I know that she might throw questions, but does anybody in the audience have anything? Julia, have you read anything?
this is the first time you haven't aged me up by rounding up to the next decade of how many years we've been married. We have been chatting and chatting in the chat, but alas, I don't really think there's any questions that didn't get answered within the chat. However, I do have some questions. I wanted to start actually with a question for you, Jason. You started to say a little bit about how you selected the order of the stories, and that's kind of, I'm curious because I know, obviously you and Incher have an idea of how you're gonna how everything's gonna get arranged and put together. So I'm curious because I think one of the times you said something about you went from funniest or something, at least funny to funniest or something. But anyway, this time, what was your thought as you were kind of putting together the order of the stories?
Well, there was a lot more humor in the summer collection, because when people were asked to do summer stories, somehow roughly 33% of them decided to
Alethea is showing it off for us.
So what I do is I create a spreadsheet, and Incher and I will share this back and forth. We create a spreadsheet of the stories that we've chosen, and they're not in any particular order. One of the columns is title, and then I'll start putting just terms into other columns that'll say things like 1970s or traditional Gothic or funny or sci-fi or what have you. And what I'm looking for is how to filter them together so that as you read through, you'll try never to follow one story after. You don't want to ever land on a story that's just like the last one that you read. So if the last one that you read is very sort of hard-hitting and
I think you froze, at least for me. Did you freeze for everybody else? Yep. All right. Maybe he'll come back here in a second.
it has lots of dripping. Am I back now?
Yeah.
Am I? Okay,
yeah.
I'm so sorry.
That's
the
okay.
magic of editing, hopefully we'll get rid of all this. Or not. I mean, maybe just, okay. But basically, I'll do all those columns. And the goal is that if you read something that's really grisly and like dripping hooks and all that stuff like in Michael's story, the next one you want to be a little bit poetic and change the feel so that you get that impression of waves as you go through. And I like the idea here, since Gothic romance is such a is a genre that looks very much at the past. I love the idea of the last story being one that looked to the future, which is why we close on the Poor Man's Roses. Yeah, but it's a spreadsheet, and with the summer one, it was very easy to create that rhythm by just labeling which ones were funny, because, like I said, every third one was funny, and that was super useful. I've probably talked too much about this, but thank you.
No, that's perfect. And then for Incher, we actually started talking, I think, before we recorded about your cover and the weird window. I'm looking at it at the. I don't know if you could see it with my background, probably not. But anyway, the window at the top that I believe everybody decided was a. Oh, there you go. Rob's showing it. That I believe people decided was a witch window to like keep witches in,
by
out.
The way.
Yeah, well, Rob's showing it, but yes. But yeah, tell us, Incher, kind of how you design this one, how you design them in general, and how do you put them together? How do you you said something about Frankensteining them. I'm really curious how that works.
Well, first of all, I went back and looked at the original image again, and it is a window, but it's more a lattice work of windows. It's very strange. It almost looks like shingles, like the way that the image is. And since I didn't draw it, I can't really explain exactly what it is, Henry. But but anyway, so yeah, there's the cover.
Yeah.
So that actually is a composite of 3 different images. And actually, the woman is actually a photograph that I changed and filtered her to make it look like an illustration, so it matched the rest of it. So the house is one, the woman is another image, and then the sky is a different effect as well. So all different colors, all different tones. They all had to be kind of tweaked, and she had to be cut out of her original image and placed into this one. And then, you know, I run color gradients over the whole thing, and some texture as well. But I really enjoyed putting this one together because I was inspired by all the different women running from houses covers from the past. And so you should, there was actually another version. There were actually a couple of other versions of this cover with different women in different houses. And I remember showing Jason the first concept that I came up with, because he was, you know, we weren't sure whether we could actually pull this off because we didn't have the budget to like go out and hire an illustrator. And so I kind of Frankensteined, basically, you know, cut out images, placed them all together, and composited it and showed it to Jason. He goes, "Oh, well, that kind of works." So so I'm glad it came out really well. And yeah, I'm really happy with this one. This is actually my favorite anthology cover out of all of them.
I'm shocked that it came out. I have great faith in you as an artist, but the fact that you could make this look like, she looks like a painting. It's amazing. It really looks like a painting.
Well, the people in the chat are giving high praise to the cover, saying it's awesome. It is beautiful. Yeah, Intro does really good work. I don't know if, yeah, I don't know if I've actually said that to your face.
Yeah.
But I always am amazed at everything you do. So that's
I like
really...
Alethea's question. We should grab that one. That's a good question.
What was the question?
She says, "What are people's favorite Gothics?" And I know that not everybody has them, but I know that some people very sincerely have some favorites to hit on. So yeah, I'll shut up now.
Well,
Tim Burton's Batman.
Yeah, go ahead, go for it, Jeremiah. Do you have more to say about that? But
No,
why?
I just love. I mean, Batman has got a lot of Gothic influences. Obviously, Gotham itself is Gothic, and Tim Burton's Batman really, you know, obviously I've gone back and done more Gothic research on that stuff, and you know, horror specific stuff. Tim Burton's Batman is Gothic, especially Batman Returns. That's a pretty Gothic movie right there.
Do you want to take a stab, or does anybody want to take a stab at what Gothic means in that context?
I think Amanda probably would.
Oh, I wasn't ready to comment on Batman.
No. Well, do you want to take a stab at what Gothic means to you?
Well, I was, oh gosh. Well, it combines three things that I really love. Actually more, but the three to start with are mystery, some kind of supernatural or ghostly thing, and a love story. And when I discovered Barbara Michael's Gothics, I actually found that you could bring in the funny too, which is something that I always try to bring in, even when it's a creepy story. And she showed me that you could play with the conventions of the Gothic, and you play with the formula, and you make a story more unexpected, less predictable, and funny, and spooky, and romantic. So really, reading her books was like what sort of brought it all together for me, made me realize this is where I belong.
Excellent, thank you.
I'm totally gonna jump in because the visual aids I brought are all my Barbara Michaels books, because
awesome.
The woman is amazing. So here we go with Someone in the House, right? And it's got that lovely peekaboo cover. Someone's in the house. We've got The Wizard's Daughter, the castle of which could have even come from the cover of our book, because it's just that cover. We have House of Many Shadows. So many shadows. Now, Barbara Michaels was also Elizabeth Peters. She wrote the Amanda Peabody mysteries, the Egypt mysteries. My best friend liked those, but I was a Barbara Michaels fan. I think my favorite was this one,
Oh, beautiful.
Shattered Silk. Shattered Silk was about, I think this is the one about the vintage clothing restorer and how she discovers all of this amazing vintage clothing. And there's this whole, romance and humor, and it just, it has everything. So there's another Barbara Michaels one I actually stole from my library called Devil May Cry. It's a great one. So yes, I highly ditto Amanda, and I totally recommend Barbara Michaels. This has been Alethea content for Barbara Michaels.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Well, and I see Bonnie Joe said that she's loving Mexican Gothic.
Yeah, which is like the current New York Times bestseller. And I haven't read it yet, but I've heard it's really wonderful.
Could I jump in with a couple of keys to the Gothic, because I teach a very I run through the history of Gothic fiction in like 45 minutes in panel form. So I have a couple of pointers as like what constitutes a Gothic that I think are really important for people to know, because I think we say Gothic and people actually just think maybe goth, which is, I mean, I am goth, but also I write Gothic novels. So from a literary standpoint, there's a few things that really make a Gothic and not some other genre. Gothic by its nature is an assemblage of genres, and I think that's part of why it's hard to describe. But really, one of the main keys to a Gothic story is that dread is the engine. So the engine of the Gothic is dread. Suspense is what is driving it forward. Setting is character. And I think that all of us in this story in this anthology do a really good job of setting as character. And it has to have a psychological focus. So you've got this dread, a psychological focus, and setting as character. And how all of those things interact is kind of the beautiful nuance of the Gothic. And I think for a lot of folks who don't really understand Gothic fiction, they're coming at it just from a horror perspective. They expect a lot of jump scares. They expect it to be just horror. So something like Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak, which I love, folks were hoping for more jump scares. I've seen the same thing about The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is a brilliant television show. It's a great adaptation of Henry James' Turn of the Screw and other Henry James works that they've worked in, but it's very Gothic. It's not full of jump scares. It's very subtle in its horror. It's a psychological focus with setting as character and this engine of dread, because you just know terrible things are going to continue to happen. So those are my rubrics of what makes a Gothic a Gothic.
That's excellent. Thank you.
That was excellent.
I'd like to jump in too.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please, John.
So I was reading Peter Haining's anthology of original like Gothic literature from like the 18th century, and I was surprised at a lot of the content there, because there was a lot of like explicitly like sort of Orientalist stuff, which I don't usually associate. But one of the things that I noticed that goes throughout the whole history of the Gothic, as far as I can tell, is that it's as Leanna said, it's sort of an amalgam of genres. It's very popular, popular literature for regular people to the extent that was possible, and also that it is formally experimental, right? Because of the first Gothic novel was the author pretended that it was a translation of a document that was found, the Castle of Otranto, and it sort of structurally a lot of the Gothic novels are very much like Walpole's actual house that he built, that was his quote-unquote Gothic house, the Strawberry Hill, where he just took all of the old architecture that he liked from all different places and kind of bundled it together in a way that didn't make sense. Sort of like, if you've ever seen McMansion Hell, Strawberry Hill is sort of like that. And then he collected all these curios. He collected John Dee's magic mirror, and he had all sorts of stuff. And Gothic is all the way through was kind of like that. So I'm looking at these 18th century stories, and they're stealing from very interesting stuff. So there's one story that was like, what if Faust, but with spiders, demon
Mhm.
spiders in a tree, so I think it's interesting to carry on the tradition here. And I think sometimes we forget that old books can also be pulp. And I
Yeah.
think the pulpiness of Gothic is very important in that it's, you know, popular and it's done relatively quickly and drawing in all sorts of stuff. If you write fast enough, you can't censor yourself.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to share a book that I discovered not long ago. This is The Survivors by, I don't know if you can see that, but it's by Anne Edwards, who actually quit writing novels and became this like well-known biographer of famous people. So she would like write like biographies of Princess Di. But what I love about, I'm sorry, I'm just sort of getting high on the smell of the old paper. But but what was great about The Survivors is it was like a sequel to We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is probably one of my favorite Gothic stories, which is you know, Shirley Jackson's just meditation on sisters and practical magic, and I don't know, let's see. So The Survivors, and for me, I really discovered this when I got into Mistress of Melon, you know, and those early Gothic romances that were really ripoffs of Rebecca. So, so yeah, but
You know how people say they wish they could bottle something? Jason has sort of bottled the smell of old books because he has a cabinet that it's really closed really tight. When you open it, it's just all these paperbacks. So it's just the
really
smell just wafts out.
yeah, it's true. It's all vintage paperbacks in there. It's kind of crazy, but yeah.
I'll mention
yeah.
Virginia Kaufman, who is my favorite of the 60s, 70s Gothic romance writers. And my favorite book of hers is The Vampire of Mora. And the Mora series actually has several books in it about the same character. But the interesting thing to me about that one is they're actual vampires, because so many Gothics, it tends to be the Scooby-Doo thing where it's, you know, really old man Miller who wants your oil rights. But in this case, they're actually vampires. So it's like, okay, this is sort of up and running. In fact, it's kind of similar to Brides of Dracula, you know, the Hammer film, because it is about a girls' school that's more or less run by, in this case, the vampires. So yeah, but she's my favorite of that crew. And I like Dorothy Daniels. I like Victoria Holt. But some amazing stuff.
The great thing about Victoria Holt and all that stuff is that that's the stuff that is almost specifically like genuinely narrowly Gothic romance. You know, a female main character arrives at an old house, takes a position that allows her to move between upstairs and downstairs, discovers secrets in the old house, and because it's a romance, also discovers love. And that, if you wanted to, that's the straight and narrow of the Gothic romance. But you know, for this anthology, and I think for most of us, because what we're really interested in is this love of antiquity, you can kind of cast your net far and wide. But Julia just asked a question, not the Julia that's upstairs, but our guest Julia. Those of you who wrote sci-fi, what do you see as the overlap between sci-fi and Gothic? What were you interested in peering those two genres together? Who wants to take a crack at that?
I'd jump in on that since mine is one of the sci-fi-ish stories. For me, using the sci-fi was just a way to really go all out on the Gothic while still telling a more contemporary story, because I wanted to play with, you know, the Gothic motifs that put the woman in a terrible inferior position, and play that off a modern woman who's a strong woman, and yet still, but I'm still putting her in the position of being inferior to, in an inferior professional position to a man that she becomes involved with. And I was able to, so there was the way to, the science fiction thing was a way to do both the classic motifs while still doing a modern story. And it was a fun challenge because I've never read any Gothic romances. I was familiar with the covers because I've worked in the book business for a long time. But then I was just going off so much what Jason put in the description. That, there was just a list of the classic motifs of the genre. And then, of course, I went back and did some research on Rebecca and other classic Gothic novels. And so I just kind of had this checklist of the motifs that I wanted to make sure that I used. And then I also had fun with using, we talked earlier about location as being an important part, and how there's a lot of classic Gothics that, they're on the moors or they're on the water. And I wanted to use that as well. And I had some fun with that because I set the modern day real life setting of the story on a sort of a spooky bluff overlooking Lake Superior. And I'm from Minnesota. I'm very familiar with the bluffs overlooking Lake Superior. So I was able to use my sort of hometown knowledge. But it's a very organic part of the story because in the dream sequences, then she's also on a bluff, and that was a way to tie the themes through the dream sequences and the sort of real life version. Because I was doing, there's a lot of writing advice that tells you never to open up a story with a dream. And that's what I did, but I made sure that it wasn't just a random thing. The dreams are an integral, organic part of the overall plot.
I think if it's a sci-fi story about people who are conducting experiments in dreams, you've discovered the only exception to not opening a story with a dream.
I actually had a hour-long phone discussion with an actual sleep specialist to get his point of view on the technology I was imagining and the use of dreams and stuff like that in helping people with sleep problems and PTSD. So I was really playing off some real world stuff, but just taking it just far enough into the future that I could do my whole VR dream thing.
I love that. That's really cool.
Jason, can I add a little bit to what Scott just said?
Yeah, please.
There's a very interesting place where science fiction and Gothic overlaps, I believe. Gothic quite often involves people being trapped inside expectations, whether it's societal expectations or the expectations of their family, or the limits put on them by the setting as a character. Science fiction tends to be about pretty much the exact opposite about that. It's like the expansion of what we can become in the future, of what we can become because we have this technology, or pushing against the restrictions or the expectations. And I find it absolutely fascinating to combine those two ideas, because the two genres are basically rooted in a very different mindset, a very different way of looking at the world.
Just wanted to mention that, and thank you very much, that there's the story by Amanda, which isn't a science fiction story, but it plays into that fascination with technology that occurred, around the time of the period, and it almost works as a science fiction story.
Which is, a major part of Dracula.
Yeah, for sure.
The fact that they're dealing with technology versus old school occultism. and they bring in everything from typewriters to, recording devices, blood transfusions, so it definitely plays into that. There's a lot really of that at, I guess, at the turn of the century where that was occurring.
Yeah, because the world is changing. Mina makes a big deal about how she's the modern woman, right?
Yep, the new woman.
With all of her with all of her office technology.
Yep, the old world versus the new.
Alethea and Incher, you guys did sci-fi stories. Incher, I don't know if you've thought about the connection between sci-fi and Gothic. Do you have anything that you'd like to add there?
Well, when I think of sci-fi Gothic, I start off with Frankenstein, obviously. The guy's creating life from lifelessness. And there's a through line between that all the way to like Blade Runner, with the replicants. Yeah, I grew up reading Heinlein and Alan Dean Foster and all of those guys. And science fiction, it has, it's a great, medium to explore those Gothic themes, right?
With a new frame, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's what I love is you've plopped this castle onto this boiling mass of a planet where it doesn't belong. This is really cool. Alethea, did you have any thoughts? Any thoughts here?
Yes, I have thoughts. Can I share some thoughts?
Please.
Oh my gosh, Sam said amazing things, and Charles touched on Dracula, which, if you think about my story, it could just as easily have been a vampire. He takes her blood and uses it to elongate his life and make him a better person. But the reason I said it in a science fiction setting was to blow up the world. I had to have that horrible post-apocalyptic, so that it didn't matter if she ran, because it was possibly worse, even worse than staying. And when you're in a situation like that and you feel trapped, as Sam said, you're trapped in your own mind, you go inward. And ultimately it's about female power. It's like Leanna said, it's about the dread. It's about the dread and the female power, because even though this man has trapped her, she still has immense power. He's the one taking her power, and she's got to find a way to get it back. The science fiction I read when I was a kid was all Andre Norton and, oh my God, the number of people. But it was Diane Duane, and her Star Trek novels were so good. I read the female science fiction writers, and I think they come at it differently. I mean, now once I got older and I started to branch out a little bit with, Orson Scott Card and some of the male science fiction writers, I didn't like them as much. I have to admit, I really preferred the female, like the brain ships, and I loved all that because it also incorporated the drama and that raw emotion that is very Gothic. It's absolutely very Gothic. So that's the place I wanted this story to be.
Thank you very much. And the funny thing is, you keep mentioning that you believe that your protagonist is walking into certain death. And the funny thing is, I actually didn't read it that way. I thought that she's probably going to make it somehow. But it's a good question. It's funny, by the way, Henry Herz just asked a question in the chat room that said, how about a sci-fi theme for number 5? And I'm really torn because that's a possibility, but Alethea held up a book earlier with a die cut on the cover, and I'm wondering if there's some way to play fictionally with the idea of die. This is another, I have a bizarre and regrettable obsession with mid-century effluvia, and one of them is those horrible covers, and yeah, see the die cut? Yes, anything written, with like a baby skeleton on the cover riding a tricycle and like
Paperbacks from hell.
Yes, exactly. Any of those. Oh, dude, man.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the title.
That's the that's with the already a book. We can't use that.
Trademark. Darn it.
I just want to jump in here and say that as a former bookseller, those die cut covers are just a nightmare because they always tear and get hooked on everything.
Oh, that reminds me, guys, speaking of that at Gothics, you may have seen it on Twitter or Facebook, but this week I got a life-size Strahd standee, from Ravenloft.
Oh yeah,
yeah, because it's a book dump from 1993, but he's huge. He's like
cool.
5.5 feet tall, so he's really. I have those with the embossed covers with the Strahd the vampire. So, which actually something we haven't really talked about. One of the big things in Gothics, particularly the originals, Otranto, Adolfo, particularly Melmouth the Wanderer, but we have the hero villain, the figure who is kind of driving things that the woman's either drawn to or trying to get away from, or usually both. And you get that in the Gothic romance as well. They've kind of adapted it. It's funny because in so many of the 60s, 70s Gothics, there's two guys. There's the really dangerous guy and there's the seemingly nice guy. And you think you should like the nice guy, but you like the dangerous guy. But it turns out that the nice guy is actually dangerous. The dangerous guy is actually nice.
That's what that was is a popularization of Jane Eyre, right? Where you got Rochester and you got St. John. And St. John's not a bad guy. In Jane Eyre, St. John is just kind of a drip compared with Rochester, who is George C. Scott, and so but yes, I love that pattern repeats over and over. It's funny playing with these ideas of like there's die cuts. I used to work in a bookstore and I was a cover stripper. I had to strip the covers so that you could return the books for credit. That's another thing that we could play with a little bit, the notion of stripped books. I don't know what exactly that anthology would be, but it's a fun idea, to call something stripped books.
Jason, we should start winding down. By the way, I just noticed on the Facebook event that it said it started at 6:30. So I'm hoping we didn't lose people who showed up at 6:30 and it didn't have. I was just looking at that to see what
we did start at 6:30.
Oh, did we start at 6:30? Oh, yeah. Okay. Then it's been. Has it really been an hour and a half already?
It has.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Well, then we should definitely wind down. I was thinking we started at 7. I was like, okay, cool. Well, I just wanted to remind or let everybody know, if you didn't already know it, that you can save the chat. But you can do that because there's a lot of good recommendations in the chat. So if you click on the little 3 dots right above where you can type a comment in, it says save chat. And then if you're like me, you'll never ever find where it's saved. So go to show in folder and rename it and then put it somewhere where you'll find it. But because that's been really fun too, just following people's recommendations and clever comments, etc.
When we upload it to YouTube, could we link to the saved chat? Or do we have to sort of get permission from everybody who spoke?
I actually have never really given it. When I upload the video to YouTube, it'll be an edited version of all of this. Mm-hmm. So it'll probably be a little bit shorter. And
if we can figure out how.
But I might be able to I'll just lift from the chat the recommendations and put them into the description of the video. That'll be the best way to do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you bet. And how do so Joya, you just said that, and so now I have to figure out how to, can you save the chat, Joya?
I love teaching people new things. Yeah. Excuse me.
People who want to teach me new things, just do them for me.
Yeah, but that doesn't, well, and since I live in your house, I am doing it. No, so if you go to the chat, somebody's asking again how to do it. Okay. So it says, where it says type message here, in the top right-hand corner of that little box, there's 3 dots more. And then it just says save chat at the top.
I do not see that at all.
Okay, well, you're lucky you have me then. Anyway, thank you, Amanda, for that comment. I took this picture at the cemetery that I mentioned earlier in the chat that I have a ghost picture. Also, that's not the one though. The only picture I've been taking pictures. I've taken 100,000 pictures in my life. I'd never gotten one with an orb, except for random little, spots of dirt. But this is like a little oval with oval light with purple oval light that's kind of behind it, it looks like angel wings. Super cool, neat old cemetery that we went to. Well, thank you so much, Jason. I don't know if you had any closing comments or intro, but this has been really fun for me.
Thank you for helping us, Julia. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for the questions, and I've just been really honored to get a chance to edit everybody here. I feel like you've all become new friends, and I hope we work together again soon. For those of you in the chat who haven't ordered yet, I put the link there for the Castle of Horror Anthology Volume 4, and we'll be back soon. I don't even know what the next collection is, but thank you so much, and everybody have an absolutely wonderful evening. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.